He screamed, "I'll never marry you." A year later, he saw their twin daughters and broke down in the hospital hallway. Alexa Walsh had never imagined her life would turn into a scene so devastating, so humiliating, that it would leave a mark on her soul forever. She had rehearsed this moment countless times in her head, standing tall, calmly delivering the news, prepared for surprise, maybe even discomfort. But nothing had prepared her for the reaction she got. She stood in the sleek glass and steel office of Bennett Holdings, her fingers nervously clutching the small ultrasound photo in her pocket. The early morning sun poured through the panoramic windows behind the imposing mahogany desk where Jason Bennett sat in his signature tailored navy suit, skimming through financial reports as if nothing in the world could shake him. Her heart pounded as she cleared her throat, barely able to find her voice. "Jason," she began, her voice trembling in a way she hadn't anticipated. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, sudden and sharp, cutting through the calm stillness of the room. He didn't look up at first. When he finally did, his piercing blue eyes met hers, but they held no warmth, no surprise, no joy, only calculation. The seconds dragged on in silence until he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and said almost lazily, "I will never marry you." No emotion, no questions, just that. Cold, dismissive, final. Alexa felt the air leave her lungs. The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved, despite every red flag and every warning from her own instincts, was gone. Or maybe he had never existed. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. There was nothing to say. Her mind raced, searching for logic, for a reason, for some shred of the man who once whispered that she meant more to him than any deal or title. Instead, she was looking at someone else entirely, someone indifferent, impenetrable, and mercilessly detached. He didn't ask whose it was. He didn't ask how far along. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply stood, straightened the cuffs of his jacket and said, "This conversation is over." She wanted to scream, to cry, to demand acknowledgement. But something inside her, something deeper than pride, held her still. She nodded once, turned around, and walked out of the office with her back straight, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. As the elevator doors closed behind her, her vision blurred with tears, but her face remained calm. She knew in that moment that she was entirely alone. And yet she also knew she would survive. Not for him, not for the past, but for the life growing inside her. The days that followed were a blur of silence, cold rain, and crushing reality. Alexa packed up her things and left the city without telling anyone. Her apartment lease was under Jason's company. She couldn't bear the thought of staying there another night, breathing the same air that had once smelled like home, but now only reeked of betrayal. She moved back to a small town 2 hours away, the one she had grown up in, quiet and tucked away from the chaos of the corporate world. She hadn't been there in years, but the streets were familiar enough to make her feel like she could at least breathe again. She rented a modest one-bedroom apartment above an old bookstore and started working remotely, taking on small freelance design projects at night while the morning sickness wrecked her body. Each day was harder than the last. There were no calls from Jason, no attempts to find her, no messages asking if she was okay. The rejection stung deeper than she let herself admit. She cried most nights alone in her narrow bed, holding the ultrasound picture to her chest as her belly slowly began to grow. The loneliness was suffocating, but she kept going. She attended all her doctor appointments by herself, checked off lists of prenatal vitamins, and tried to eat as best she could. Her heart ached, not only from the absence of love, but also from the overwhelming pressure of doing this alone. She had no family to lean on. Her mother had passed away 2 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, and her father had been absent since she was a child. There was no one but her and the 2 tiny lives quietly forming inside her. By her second trimester, the doctor confirmed she was carrying twins. She had smiled when she saw them clearly on the screen. 2 little profiles, tiny arms moving independently, two separate heartbeats beating strong and fast. It was a brief moment of hope in an otherwise gray existence. She walked out of that appointment clutching the printed sonogram photos tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks, not from fear this time, but from something closer to awe. No matter what happened next, she had them, and that had to be enough. As the weeks turned into months, her body became heavier and more tired. She still worked long hours because the medical bills piled up quickly and insurance barely covered the essentials. Some nights she would fall asleep with her laptop open beside her, aching all over, but refusing to give in. She kept a notebook on the nightstand where she wrote letters to her daughters. She didn't know what their names would be yet, but she wrote to them like they were already here, like they could hear her voice in the quiet. She told them how much she loved them, how hard she was trying, and how one day when they were older, she would tell them everything, truthfully, but gently. She didn't allow herself to think about Jason. When his name popped into her head, she pushed it away. The man who had once made her feel seen had vanished like a ghost. There was no use mourning someone who had already chosen to disappear. Her focus had to stay on the babies and on surviving each day until they arrived. But even as she tried to let go, something in her chest remained bruised, not broken, but wounded in a way that would take time to understand. And so she moved forward, quiet and determined, with no idea that fate was already working to bring their worlds together again in a way neither of them could have imagined. By the time Alexa reached her 8th month, exhaustion had become her constant companion. The swelling in her legs made it hard to stand for long periods, and the sharp jabs in her lower back forced her to sleep sitting up most nights. Though she rarely complained aloud, her doctor began to notice signs of concern during her weekly checkups. The babies weren't gaining weight as quickly as expected, and Alexa herself was clearly pushing her limits. After a brief scare involving shortness of breath and contractions that started and stopped suddenly, she was admitted to the local hospital for observation. What was meant to be a precautionary overnight stay quickly turned into something more serious when one of the twins began showing signs of distress during monitoring. Doctors decided to perform an early C-section. Alexa was too exhausted to protest, barely able to process the words as nurses gently prepped her for surgery. Everything felt surreal, the cold of the hospital gown, the bright lights of the operating room, the blur of voices around her. She clenched her eyes shut and whispered a silent prayer that her daughters would come out breathing. And then she heard it, the first cry, thin and ready, quickly followed by a second, slightly louder one. Tears streamed down her face. Both girls were alive, small, fragile, barely over 4 pounds each, but breathing. The nurses whisked them away to the NICU while Alexa was stitched up and sent to recovery. The days that followed were a haze of beeping monitors, 4 drips, and waiting. Her daughters were named Lily and Mia, names she had written in her notebook weeks earlier but hadn't dared speak aloud until they were safely here. She could only visit them for brief periods at first, sitting beside their incubators, speaking softly through her tears. They looked so tiny, their faces nearly swallowed by the little hats and blankets meant to keep their body temperature stable. It broke her to leave them each night and return to her hospital bed alone. But she knew they were in good hands. Still, the ache of not holding them freely, of not being able to take them home, weighed heavily on her spirit. Doctors informed her that because of the baby's prematurity and her own post-op weakness, they would all remain in the hospital for at least another month, possibly longer. That time frame stretched to 2 months, then 3. Alexa's savings dwindled quickly, but she refused to show her panic. She pumped breast milk regularly, sat by their sides as much as she was allowed, and used her free hours in the hospital room to pick up online design work on her old laptop. It was lonely, painfully so, and the mental weight was starting to crack her resolve. She hadn't had a visitor in weeks. Nurses were kind but busy. Her body was healing, but her heart felt like it was on pause, stuck between survival and the life she wanted to build. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Jason arrived at the hospital completely unaware of who was there. He wasn't visiting for personal reasons. One of his senior business partners had been in a minor car accident and had been admitted for observation. Jason, ever the loyal figurehead of his empire, thought it would reflect well to stop in and check on the man in person. But between unreadable signage and a distracted receptionist, he took the wrong elevator and got off on the pediatric floor instead of general care. As he walked down the bright hallway confused, he caught a glimpse of someone, that made his feet freeze. At first, he wasn't sure. A woman in hospital pajamas, hair pulled into a lazy bun, stood near a double stroller, adjusting a bottle with practiced hands. Her back was turned, but something about her posture, the curve of her shoulders, looked familiar. She turned slightly, and the light hit her face. It was Alexa. Jason stood there, stunned. He felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. She hadn't seen him yet. She was softly humming, rocking the stroller gently. Then she looked up, and their eyes met. The world seemed to go still for both of them. Her face paled. He took an uncertain step forward. Neither of them said a word. And then, slowly, he lowered his gaze to the two infants sleeping side by side in the stroller. Both had delicate dark hair, and when one stirred and opened her eyes, startlingly blue and familiar, he felt his stomach drop. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. These were his children. Not a rumor. Not a suspicion. There they were, real, living proof of the life he had rejected. Alexa said nothing. She didn't cry or scream. She picked up the bottle, turned her back to him, and walked calmly into the hospital room. But Jason couldn't move. His body was rooted to the spot, heart thundering in his chest. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do next. Jason stood outside the hospital room door for several minutes, unable to convince his legs to move or his mouth to form words. His brain was still trying to catch up with what his eyes had seen. Two tiny girls who looked so much like him that it felt like staring at baby pictures of himself. The woman he had once dismissed without a second thought was standing just on the other side of that door, raising their children alone, while he had been going about his life as if nothing had ever happened. A nurse passed by and glanced at him with mild concern, but he quickly straightened up and knocked twice, gently but firmly. There was a pause. Then the door opened halfway. Alexa stood there, calm but guarded, her eyes unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She raised her eyebrows slightly, waiting, then finally stepped aside and motioned for him to come in. The room was small, dimly lit, with a cot pushed up against the wall and two bassinets near the window. One of the girls was asleep, the other squirming softly, making tiny noises as she waved her fists in the air. Jason walked in slowly, as if one sudden movement might shatter the fragile moment. He moved closer to the bassinets and stared down at the baby. Her eyes were closed, but her face was a mirror of his mother's. There was no denying it. These were his daughters. Are they? He began, his voice barely above a whisper. Alexa didn't look at him. She sat down on the edge of the cot and crossed her arms tightly. Yes, she said simply. They're yours. The words hit him like a blow. He staggered slightly, then pulled up the plastic chair near her bed and sat down heavily. The room was quiet except for the occasional beep from a nearby monitor and the soft sighs of the sleeping infants. Jason ran a hand through his hair, staring down at the floor, then up at her. She looked so different from the last time he had seen her, tired, pale, worn, but stronger somehow, more grounded, as if everything he had overlooked before had finally surfaced. Why didn't you tell me? He asked eventually, his tone more confused than accusatory. Alexa let out a dry laugh, not cruel, but bitter. I did. You just didn't care to listen. He opened his mouth to protest but stopped, because she was right. He had cut her off, dismissed her, shut the door on any possibility that the pregnancy was real or that it mattered. Now he sat in the wreckage of that moment, trying to pick up pieces that might be too broken to mend. He looked at her again. Really looked this time, not as a problem to solve or a mistake to erase, but as a person who had endured something he couldn't yet comprehend. I didn't know, he said quietly. And I didn't know what kind of man I was until now. Alexa turned to him then, not softening, but meeting him head-on. They've been in this hospital for 3 months, she said. They were premature. I had surgery. I almost lost one of them. I haven't left this room for more than an hour in weeks. So forgive me if I'm not exactly thrilled to see you standing here like you want a medal for showing up late. Her voice wasn't raised, but the anger underneath it trembled like something tightly contained. Jason nodded, not defensively, but with real weight. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. He looked at his daughters, then back at her. Can I stay? He asked. Just for a little while. Alexa didn't answer immediately. She looked at her babies, both now asleep again, and something shifted in her face. Less fury, more fatigue. She nodded once, then laid back on the cot and closed her eyes. Jason remained where he was, not moving, just sitting there in stunned silence. He didn't know what this meant yet. Didn't know what came next. But he understood one thing with complete clarity: this was no longer about pride or ego or control. It was about showing up. For once in his life, he was willing to start there. Jason returned the next day, earlier than he expected himself to. He hadn't slept much the night before. His mind had been a restless stream of images and thoughts that didn't let him find peace. The sight of those 2 girls, so small and delicate, yet so undeniably his, had embedded itself in him in a way nothing else ever had. He found himself standing again in front of the same hospital room door by 7 o'clock in the morning, carrying a paper bag with coffee and a small container of oatmeal, not sure if Alexa would accept them, but needing to try. He hesitated before knocking, worried she might not want to see him again after yesterday. But when the door opened, she didn't seem surprised. She just looked at the bag and said, "You're late." It wasn't forgiveness, but it wasn't rejection either. He stepped inside, and she took the coffee without comment. The babies were awake, fussy but calm, and Jason walked over to their bassinets instinctively. He peered down at Mia, who was chewing her fist, her tiny brows furrowed as if she was concentrating hard. Alexa watched him carefully but didn't interfere. She noticed his hesitation when he reached for the baby bottle, and without speaking, she passed it to him, allowing him to feed Mia under her silent supervision. His hands were awkward, but he was careful. Mia accepted the bottle, and Jason stared at her in awe as her small lips latched on. Something about the weight of that moment grounded him in a way no boardroom negotiation ever had. From that day forward, Jason came every morning and stayed until evening. He brought food, asked questions, read baby books in the waiting room during the girls' nap times, and slowly learned how to change diapers and swaddle properly. Alexa didn't make it easy for him. She didn't pretend that his sudden involvement erased months of absence, but she didn't push him away either. She gave him tasks to do, let him take turns holding the girls, and even let him be present during some of the check-ins with the pediatrician. She remained cool, practical, and focused entirely on the babies, never hinting at whether she saw a future for the 2 of them beyond this temporary hospital rhythm. Still, something began to shift. In the quiet hours of the day, when the girls were napping and the nurses had done their rounds, Jason and Alexa would sometimes talk, not about them, not about the past, but about things that felt neutral and safe. He asked her about the freelance work she'd been doing, and she told him about the small project she'd taken on, how she'd used her skills to scrape by. He told her about his company's expansion, but in a softer, more human way, like someone describing a life he wasn't sure mattered anymore. She listened, sometimes nodded, but often stayed silent. Yet her silence no longer felt cold. It felt cautious, like someone trying to rebuild a wall that had been blown apart. One afternoon, as he was holding Lily against his chest, the baby drifted off to sleep, and Jason found himself tearing up. He didn't cry openly, but his eyes grew glassy, and he blinked several times to keep the tears from falling. Alexa saw it and said nothing. She simply passed him a burp cloth without comment, and he accepted it with a grateful look. That moment, quiet and brief, felt like the first thread of trust pulling taut between them. Neither of them spoke about it afterward, but something unspoken hung in the air from that day on. Jason stopped checking his phone during visits. He stopped answering work emails from the hospital room. His assistants were baffled by his absence, but he gave no explanations. For the first time in years, business didn't come first. The girls did. And while Alexa didn't verbalize it, she noticed. She watched as he adjusted, learned, and tried. And though she didn't say the words aloud, a sliver of her was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he meant it this time. By the end of the 5th week, the nurses no longer raised their eyebrows when Jason walked in and picked up one of the girls as naturally as if he had always been there. And though Alexa still kept her walls high, her gaze lingered on him longer. Her tone softened slightly, and when he brought a tiny stuffed giraffe for Lily and a pacifier with a blue ribbon for Mia, she didn't scoff. She smiled, barely, but it was real. Jason saw it, tucked it quietly into his heart, and didn't push for more. For now, showing up was enough. By the beginning of the 3rd month, Jason had seamlessly folded himself into the daily rhythm of the hospital. No longer an awkward visitor, but a consistent presence. The nurses spoke to him by name, handing him updates on Lily and Mia without needing to ask who he was. Alexa noticed the subtle shift too, how naturally he moved now, how confidently he handled the bottles, how he knew the exact lullaby that helped Lily fall asleep when she was restless. He wasn't just trying anymore. He was here, every day, without fail, without excuse. The girls had gained weight steadily, and were finally nearing the threshold for discharge. Alexa, though relieved, was also quietly terrified. For 3 months, they had existed in this cocoon, sterile and small, but safe. She had grown used to the monitors, the nurses, the shared responsibility. The hospital had become the strange bubble where her life had stabilized, where her heartbreak had been placed on pause by necessity. But soon she would leave. And then what? Back to a tiny apartment with barely enough space for one crib, let alone 2. Back to the grind of working all night while raising 2 infants on her own. And now, with Jason's presence becoming something consistent, something her daughters had already come to expect, what would happen if he disappeared again? Jason seemed to sense her anxiety, though she never spoke it aloud. One evening, as Alexa sat folding the girls' hospital clothes in silence, he gently asked, "Where will you go when they're discharged?" She hesitated, then replied carefully, "Back to my apartment. It's small, but I've managed." He looked at her for a long moment, not with pity, but with something more complex. Admiration, guilt, hesitation. "You shouldn't have had to manage alone," he said. Alexa didn't respond. The silence between them was thick with everything they hadn't said. The next morning, he arrived with more than just coffee. He handed her an envelope. Inside was a printed lease to a small house a few blocks from her current apartment, one with 2 bedrooms, a yard, and a nursery already furnished. Alexa stared at it in disbelief. "I don't want you to think this is some grand gesture," he said. "You don't owe me anything. It's just a place, somewhere safer, easier for them." She didn't answer right away. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect her independence, her pride. But then she looked over at Mia, who had just started trying to roll over, and Lily, who had finally gained enough strength to cry loudly when she wanted to be held. Alexa's pride wasn't more important than their well-being. Still, she made her voice steady. "You're not buying us," she said. Jason nodded. "I know. That's not what this is." Later that evening, while the babies slept, Alexa stood at the window, arms crossed as she watched the streetlights flicker below. Jason was reading quietly on the couch, one hand resting near Lily's bassinet. He didn't talk much anymore, not unless she started the conversation. She appreciated that. It gave her space. Still, tonight felt heavier than usual. "Why did you really come back that day?" she asked suddenly. He didn't look up at first. Then he closed the book and said, "Because I got lost on the wrong floor. And then I saw you, and I realized everything I'd spent my life chasing meant nothing compared to what I threw away." His honesty stunned her, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Quietly, without drama, without expectation. It wasn't a performance. It was just truth. She didn't reply, but she didn't turn away either. She stood by the window a little longer, and when she finally sat down, she did so beside him. The gap between them was still wide, but not as wide as it had been. The following week, the doctors finally gave the official word. Lily and Mia were ready to go home. Jason was in the room when the announcement came, and Alexa watched him blink quickly, as if holding back tears. Discharge papers were signed, car seats were brought in, and tiny outfits chosen. Jason carried the bags. Alexa carried Mia. A nurse carried Lily out into the waiting hallway. For the first time in months, they stepped out of the hospital into the open air, the evening light casting soft shadows on the pavement. Jason didn't ask to ride with them. He didn't offer. He simply followed in his own car, parked across the street from her building, and waited until she unlocked the front door. He helped bring in the bags and then stood in the doorway, uncertain. Alexa looked at him, then stepped aside to let him in. It was small, tight, barely room for the bassinets. But it was warm, and it was hers. And now, for the first time, it felt like maybe it didn't have to be hers alone. The first days at home were harder than Alexa had imagined. Even after months in the hospital, despite the joy of finally being out of the sterile walls and artificial light, she now had to face the full weight of life on her own turf. 2 newborns needing her attention every hour, feedings blurring into each other, nights without sleep becoming the new routine. The apartment felt even smaller now, cribs taking up the entire bedroom, and the tiny kitchen barely accommodating a bottle sterilizer and pump. Alexa found herself struggling to manage even the simplest things like showering or preparing a full meal. The silence of the home, once a source of peace, became overwhelming in those long, crying-filled nights. Jason didn't ask to stay. He never imposed. But the day after they were discharged, he showed up at her door just after sunrise, holding grocery bags, and she didn't stop him from entering. He moved quietly through the kitchen, stocking the fridge with essentials, setting up a coffee maker, and making oatmeal while the girls still slept. When Alexa woke to the smell, for the first time in weeks, her body felt something close to safe. She walked into the kitchen, blurry-eyed and unsure of what to say, but he didn't press. He just handed her a cup of coffee and said, "Sit. Eat. I'll change them when they wake." That became their rhythm. Jason would arrive each morning and leave late in the evening. Sometimes he cooked. Sometimes he just cleaned. But he was always present. He held the girls when Alexa needed to nap, walked them around the apartment when they were fussy, and sat with them in the middle of the night when colic stole their sleep. Alexa was hesitant at first, always waiting for the moment he would stop showing up, but it never came. He returned again and again, each time more comfortable, more familiar, more quietly rooted in their lives. One evening, 2 weeks after they had come home, Alexa found him sitting on the living room floor with both girls in his lap. They were dressed in matching onesies, and he was reading from a picture book about animals, mimicking the sounds with a gentleness she never would have expected from the man who once dismissed her with such finality. She stood in the hallway, watching the 3 of them in the soft glow of the lamp, something in her chest aching in a way she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the sight of her daughter smiling. Or the warmth in Jason's. It wasn't the sound of his voice. It was that for the first time since she'd said she was pregnant, she didn't feel like she was surviving alone. He noticed her watching but didn't say anything, just continued reading, his voice calm and steady. Later that night, when the girls were asleep, Alexa offered him a beer from the fridge, an unspoken gesture of something shifting between them. They sat on the couch, shoulders barely touching, the soft hum of the baby monitor filling the silence. Jason sipped slowly, his gaze on the floor. "I think about that day in the office more than you know," he said eventually. "About what I said, what I didn't say. I was a coward. I was selfish. I thought walking away would make it disappear." Alexa didn't respond immediately. She stared straight ahead, unsure whether his regret should comfort or irritate her. But eventually, she said, "I didn't need you to be perfect. I just needed you to care." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I didn't, not then. But I do now." His voice cracked slightly, and he looked at her then, really looked, like someone seeing the full weight of what had been lost. Alexa's hands tightened around her mug. She wasn't ready to let go of all the hurt. Not yet. But she was also tired of carrying it alone. "This isn't about us," she said finally. "It's about them. I can't afford to let them trust someone who won't stay." Jason nodded again, this time slower. "Then I'll keep staying until you believe I will." And he did, day after day. Alexa stopped counting after week 4. By then, he had started helping with the freelance work, too, setting up her website, handling minor invoices, giving her the breathing room to sleep for a few hours between client calls and bottle feeds. He never brought up their past unless she did. He never hinted at wanting more. He simply became part of their life, a quiet, unwavering support. Even the neighbors began to refer to him as the girl's dad. And Alexa didn't correct them, because in every real way, he was. On the girl's 6-month mark, Jason surprised her. He had printed out every photo he had taken over the last few months, first baths, first smiles, sleepy cuddles, and arranged them into a handmade scrapbook, leaving the last page blank. When she asked why, he said softly, "Because we're still writing the rest." Alexa stared at the empty page for a long moment before she closed the book and whispered, "Let's hope the story is worth finishing." Jason reached across the couch and touched her hand. She didn't pull away. In that quiet moment, there was no forgiveness spoken, no declarations of love or dramatic promises, just presence, just choice. And for now, that was more than enough. The night before Lily and Mia's first birthday, Alexa found herself standing alone in the living room, surrounded by balloons she had yet to hang and cupcakes she hadn't frosted. The girls were asleep in their cribs after a chaotic evening bath, and Jason had gone to pick up a few last-minute decorations from the store. The apartment, though still small, now felt different, full of warmth and history, marked by the steady hum of life that had been carefully, painfully built over the past year. The walls bore signs of their story, framed photos, crayon smudges, and even a small dent near the hallway from when Jason accidentally rammed the stroller into the corner. Alexa stood quietly, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to absorb the reality of what they had become. This year had tested her in every way imaginable. There were nights she cried alone in the bathroom just to release the pressure of being everything at once, mother, provider, protector. But Jason had been there every single day, quietly reinforcing the foundation beneath her with actions, not promises. He never pushed, never rushed her healing, never made demands about what their relationship should be. Instead, he poured himself into the role of father with a devotion that sometimes stunned her. He remembered every doctor appointment. He handled fevers in the middle of the night with calm precision. He had memorized their favorite songs, their feeding schedules, even which pacifier each one preferred. Somewhere along the way, without either of them announcing it, they had become a family. When he returned that evening, arms full of streamers and paper crowns, he gave her a tired but genuine smile. "I think I bought out the party aisle," he joked. But Alexa could hear the underlying nerves in his voice. They both knew what this night symbolized. It wasn't just a birthday. It was the end of the first chapter, and possibly the beginning of something more. After the girls were tucked in again, after stories and lullabies and the stubborn refusal of Mia to fall asleep until Jason had rocked her for a full 10 minutes, Alexa and Jason found themselves sitting at the tiny kitchen table, sharing a slice of early birthday cake. The air was different, more fragile. She looked at him and said, "You've done more than I ever expected you to." He looked back at her carefully. "I didn't come here to prove something. I came because I couldn't imagine not being here." She hesitated, then stood and walked over to the small shelf in the living room where the scrapbook still sat. She opened it to the last page, the blank one, and placed a photo there she had printed just hours earlier. It was the four of them on the couch, the girls in matching pajamas, Jason mid-laugh, and Alexa looking toward him with an expression she hadn't realized had been captured. Hopeful. Open. She slid the photo into the sleeve and whispered, "That's our new first page." Jason crossed the room slowly, unsure of what to say. But before he could speak, Alexa turned to face him fully. "You hurt me more than I thought I could ever recover from," she said, her voice steady. "But you stayed. You stayed through every hard night, every diaper, every fever, every fight. You showed me who you could be, a version of you. I love him." It wasn't a dramatic kiss or a sweeping embrace. He simply stepped forward and took her hand. His fingers were trembling. "Then let me be him. For good. For you. For them." And this time, she didn't hesitate. She nodded. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself lean into him, not because she needed saving, but because she finally believed she didn't have to carry everything alone. The next morning, their apartment was filled with laughter, squealing toddlers, and the slightly off-key singing of two tired but joyful parents. Balloons bounced off the ceiling. Streamers tangled in chairs. Cupcakes smeared across tiny hands. It wasn't a perfect party, but it was real. And that made it beautiful. Friends dropped by with gifts. Neighbors popped in to hug the girls. And Alexa stood by the window at one point, holding Mia as Lily crawled after a balloon, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Jason came up behind her, his hand resting gently on her back. "I know I can't go back and rewrite everything," he said softly. "But I want to write the rest with you, whatever that looks like." Alexa turned and kissed his cheek. "Then let's keep turning the page together." And in that crowded, joyful, chaotic room, they did just that. No grand vows. No perfect ending. Just love, in its truest, most patient form. This story closes not with a dramatic twist, but with something far more powerful. Quiet redemption. What makes the ending satisfying isn't just that Jason changes, it's that he earns his way back into the lives he once walked away from. Not through apologies, but through presence, effort, and time. Alexa doesn't forgive easily, and she shouldn't. Her strength isn't just in surviving alone. It's in choosing to let someone in again, on her terms. The girls, too young to know their father's mistakes, become the very reason he becomes someone worth trusting. That's what gives this story its weight. Not just love found, but love rebuilt. And in a world where people often walk away when things get hard, watching someone stay, really stay, is the most shocking and beautiful ending of all.